Hey, it's June! Springtime! 95-degree weather here in sunny North Carolina, which means absolutely nothing relevant to this video because it's just the monthly AMA where I answer questions put to me by $5 supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar in the month of May. If you'd like to ask me whatever, just use the links in the description. Thomas Urbanski writes, as somebody from outside US, I know very little of Tea Party. Polish Wikipedia called them Populist Conservative Libertarian Party. At least in Poland, word populist is often used in a meaning of abusing stupidity of the masses in order to achieve hidden goals of small group. But it's also mostly used by people who don't have any real argument in political discussion. Yeah, that's usually the way of it, isn't it? At the same time, US ANCAP seem to point Tea Party as an example of inherent flaws of minarchism. What are key things to know about the Tea Party if someone brought them up in a discussion about large state versus minarchism versus ancapistan? The Tea Party is actually a perfect example of the news media using misinformation to destroy a movement. According to the official narrative you get from the media, the Tea Party was formed in early 2009 by a bunch of racist fascists who couldn't stand the idea that we had a black president. In reality, it formed 2 years earlier in the wake of the Ron Paul revolution as a libertarian grassroots movement. I remember one time CNN covered a Tea Party rally and specifically pointed their cameras away from signs people were holding critical of Republicans and conservatives, as many of them were. They showed a very limited segment of the protesters to make it look like they were conservatives who hated progressives, not people who hated both parties. So what did this media narrative do? Well, what do you do if you're a conservative and you see all this coverage of a conservative movement? You join them, of course. And so the media narrative resulted in conservatives joining what they thought was a conservative movement, turning it into a conservative movement. It's another example of the media creating the news, not reporting it. Some Tea Party groups resisted this, most notably the Williamsport Tea Party in Pennsylvania. At a time when Republican politicians were using the movement to get speaking engagements, the Williamsport group denied them. They were perfectly happy with them attending, but they said, and this is near to an exact quote as I can remember, "We don't want politicians to speak. We want politicians to listen." To this day, they post anti-GOP and anti-Trump stories to their Facebook page. I like this group. But the fact is, willful misinformation on the part of CNN and the rest of the news media was able to capture a grassroots movement and turn it into the political narrative they wanted it to be, not what the people were actually trying to do. They did the same crap with Occupy Wall Street. Josh Havens asks, what happens if someone buys a bunch of land around another person's land and declares no trespassing? Does the person in the middle have the freedom to get out? We've covered this several times before. Basically, there's a long-standing concept in property rights developed over centuries called right-of-way. The guy got to his property somehow. He goes to the places he needs somehow. When he goes to buy food and clothes, he has some means of getting there, generally some kind of road or trail or something like that he uses. Since that is already being made use of, no one else can homestead it. It's there for anyone who wants to use it. It's basically the only valid form of collective property in property rights theory. So, no, you can't close them off. You have to respect the right-of-way. Sean Pierre asks, is it possible for an American to live completely on crypto/barter or independent of all fiat currency? Well, I know of one American that's doing it. His name's Joel Valenzuela, and he lives in Keene, New Hampshire, and he's been one of the driving forces for crypto adoption in that area. In 2016, he closed off his bank account and decided to live completely off Bitcoin, and when Bitcoin stopped being a good alternative, he switched to Dash. I'm linking an interview he did with Box Live where he explains how he did it. Pipsqueak asks, I've heard the criticism recently that voluntary militias, PMCs, protection agencies, etc. would not be able to successfully oppose an aggressor state military. Aside from the assumptions that demand for protection wouldn't rise or that all these militias are apparently being led by Neville Chamberlain, how would you address this criticism? Well, it wouldn't be a Neville Chamberlain thing because these militias will be decentralized. They'd also have a defensive-only capability so they couldn't be misused for offense, but they also couldn't be centrally mishandled to stop them from defending against an invader. But I think the real thing to keep in mind is that whether you have a military or a citizens militia or whatever, Once an enemy gets past that line of defense, all they have to deal with is the population. If the population is unarmed, it's fairly easy, although you still get resistance movements and people opposing the system. But an armed society? Over 1/3 of American households have at least one firearm, and that number would be more were it not for idiot states like California and New York. But even at 1/3, imagine as you're going around kicking in doors to oppress the population if there was a 1 in 3 chance of there being an armed homeowner on the other side. Just look at colonial America or Vietnam to see the problems the world's biggest military at the time have dealing with a population well equipped with guns. That's the real protection. Hoplu asks, free banking or Rothbardian? So he's talking about a disagreement within the Austrian School of Economics about the role banks should be playing. Murray Rothbard insisted that all banks should be full reserve, meaning that every penny you put in a demand deposit stays there until you get it out. Banks could lend out money from time deposits, such as CDs, where you understood that you wouldn't get the money back for a while, say 6 months or a year, at which point you'd be paid back with interest. But as for demand deposits, notwithstanding any previously agreed upon service fees, the bank doing anything else with your money would be fraud and theft. So they'd basically be money warehouses. It would be kind of like paying a storage facility so much per month and you just keep all your money in the storage facility. Mises, on the other hand, was a proponent of free banking. It doesn't have to be full reserve, but banks can't just claim ownership over the money you deposit and do what they want to with it. They can take some of the money in a demand deposit for a service fee that was agreed on when the person opened the account, and of course that money would be the bank's to do whatever with. It would basically be payment for keeping your money secure, just like in the Rothbard version. But Mises also thought that you didn't have to have full reserve banking. They'd be able to loan out a certain amount as a direct investment, and the reserve rate would be agreed upon when the account was opened. The difference between this and fractional reserve is that this isn't the kind of credit expansion that leads to money creation, inflation, and boom-bust cycles. That happens when you have a central bank injecting artificial credit into the system. It wouldn't be inflationary because fractional reserve works on a multiplier effect. Whatever new money the central bank creates gets multiplied by the credit expansion. But if there's no new money injected into the system, what would a multiplier effect do? Multiply whatever you want by 0 and it's still 0. But there's still a risk. The investments the bank makes could fail and not give them their return, or there could be a run on the bank and the bank wouldn't have enough money to pay every depositor. But the difference here is that the depositor would agree to the risk in return for some kind of consideration, such as there not being any fees or maybe even some small interest payments. And if they don't like anything about the current deal, the interest or the reserve rate or whatever, they could negotiate with the bank to increase the reserve rate or the interest rate or whatever, or else they'll pull out their money and put it in another bank with more favorable terms. So I think you'd have the free market setting the appropriate reserve rate. Personally, I'm in favor of making people free to make whatever contract they want with banks in a free market. I'm linking to a lecture from Bob Murphy on the subject if anyone wants to learn more about it. Finally, Jason Maltz asks, do you think an economic crash is coming? Well, how should I know? I don't have a crystal ball. But I do have kind of a unique view on this. I don't know how many other people have this view. Maybe I'm the only one, but I think we're still in the crash from the 80s bubble. Because, in the 70s, we had that bad recession with double-digit inflation and interest rates, and Reagan and Volcker solved the problem by getting rid of price controls and interest rate controls. But then they drove up this huge 80s bubble with the expansion of credit, and that led to the failure of the S&Ls because they still had all these high interest rate loans, but as interest rates went back down, they couldn't get in the return to cover them. And you had increased FDIC and FSLIC protections, and when it all went south, of course, you had the bailouts and everything. You also had deficits getting out of control, the Fed's monetary policy got more restrictive, and then you had the oil price shock of 1990. You had a major recession in Japan that affected exports, so all of that plunged us into a recession that all the previous stuff I mentioned didn't put us in a good condition to handle. So, of course, the Fed now has to push interest rates to the floor to try and get everything going again, another artificial boom, but all it really did was paper over the troubles. The growing sector at the time was the tech sector, in particular desktop computers and the internet, so all of that led to the tech bubble, and that burst in what was called the dot bomb. So, of course, Greenspan had to make sure we had another bubble to replace it, and Paul Krugman famously said that's exactly what he should do. Create a housing bubble to replace the dot-com bubble. I'll link to that article because it always helps for people to be reminded what a nutbar Krugman is. And you know the story from there. We have the collapse of the housing sector in 2008 causing the financial crisis, which we're still not out of. I think all of this has been part of one long bust that we'll never get out of as long as the solution keeps being, let the Fed monkey with interest rates. Leave the economy alone, and it does much better. So that's it for another month. Thanks for watching, and if you really want to support this channel, nothing helps more than sharing the video and channel links with everyone you know. YouTube's been unfairly excluding independent creators like myself from lists like their related videos. So anything you can do to help pick up the slack would be wonderful. And of course, you can always help by going to donate.bogosity.tv and support by donating with PayPal or crypto, or becoming a regular supporter at Patreon or Subscribestar, or simply by downloading BitTube's airtime extension using the link and having that extension active when you watch my videos and the videos and websites of all the other creators you like. Thanks again, and until next time, stay strong and be free.